can the Kallipolis ever be real? Is this an actual serious political project, or is this something that is, kind of tongue in cheek, maybe can never really exist, but sort of, sets us up with a kind of ideal to think with? And here's what Glaucon and Socrates have to say about that subject at the end of book 9. He says, "The man who has intelligence will strain all of his powers to that end as long as he lives, in the first place, honoring the studies that will make his soul such, while despising the rest." You're talking about the ideal citizen, the ideal man, the ideal leader, right? And so Glaucon says plainly, yes, that the ideal man, the man with intelligence, will always be working toward being that kind of person, loving the good and the true above all. Next, I said, not only won't he turn the habit and nourishment of the body over to the bestial and irrational pleasure and live turned in that direction, but he'll not even look to health, nor give precedence to being strong, healthy, or fair, unless he's also going to become moderate as a result of them. Rather, he will always be seen adjusting the body's harmony for the sake of the accord of the soul. Remember that justice, right, has to do with orienting all the different parts of the soul into the right attunement, into the correct relationship with one another. He says Glaucon says that's entirely certain if he's going to be truly musical. That's what musical comes to mean in this text, right? Not just, pretty tunes, but having to do with harmony, right? Having to do with the right proportion of parts of the soul, just as the right proportion of sounds and wavelengths creates harmony and musical beauty. So if he's going to be truly musical, he'll be always doing this. And won't he also maintain order and concord in the acquisition of money, right? That was another one of the temptations, right, that draws you toward the kind of democratic sentiment. And since he's not impressed with what the many deem to be blessedness, will he give boundless increase to the bulk of his property and thus possess boundless evils? I don't suppose he will, said Glaucon. Rather, he looks fixedly at the regime within him, I said, this is Socrates, and guards against upsetting anything in it by the possession of too much or too little substance. In this way, insofar as possible, he governs his additions to and expenditure of his substance. That regime within him concept is what the concept that gets introduced right at the tail end of this book that's going to help us understand what's going on here. That's quite certain, he said. And further, with honors too, he looks to the same thing. He will willingly partake of and taste those that he believes will make him better, while those that would overturn his established habit he will flee in private and in public. Then he said, if it's that he cares about, he won't be willing to mind the political things. Now, this is the trick, right? He won't be willing to mind the political things. Glaucon says, well, if what he's doing is kind of aiming at this higher truth and keeping his attachment to such things as honor at arm's length, then Glaucon, who is an ambitious young man, we've talked about this before, a lusty, ambitious young man, he said, well, that means he'll kind of be uninterested in politics. He'll be abstracted from politics. But Socrates says, yes, by the dog, he will in his own city, very much so. However, perhaps he won't in his fatherland unless some divine chance coincidentally comes to pass. I understand, he said. You mean he will in the city whose foundation we have now gone through, the one that has its place in speeches, since I don't suppose it exists anywhere on earth. That is to say, the man who cultivates the virtue of his soul above all else is doing politics, but he's doing politics in a kind of heavenly city. And this is going to become profoundly influential, of course, for Augustine, right? For Augustine's city of God, yes, but also for the end of the Confessions, right? Near the end of the Confessions, Augustine makes a review of all his attachments to earthly things. And one of the things he discovers from this is that you can't actually just totally divorce yourself from the flesh. You can't you detach yourself from food. You need food to eat. God has made us dependent on food. And therefore, the good life consists in orienting your relationship to everything around you according to a higher standard that is beyond all such things. So you have to engage with honors. You have to engage with food and drink. You have to engage with your desires, and yet you have to do so in such a way as never to replace the highest good with them. Never put them in the highest good place, because that's idolatry, right? As a Christian would say. And Plato is basically saying something quite analogous. Socrates says, in heaven, perhaps a pattern is laid up for the man who wants to see and found a city within himself on the basis of what he sees. It doesn't make any difference whether it is or will be somewhere, for he would mind the things of this city alone and of no other. That's likely, he said. So the jokey and kind of snarky way of saying this is like, maybe the true republic was the friends we made along the way. Like the Kallipolis probably can't exist ever here in this space and time, but it does have that doesn't make it any less existent. To allude to a pop culture reference here, at the end of Harry Potter, spoiler alert, sorry, when Dumbledore encounters Harry in the kind of cerebral diaphanous platform 9 3/4 to which he travels after dying, right? He sort of goes through this mini death, and he has this whole exchange with Dumbledore about whether he goes back to fight, returns from the dead essentially, or whether he just travels on, takes the next train that comes. And as Dumbledore is walking away, Harry says, "Professor, is this all in my head or is it real?" And Dumbledore says something like, "Of course it's all in your head, Harry, but why does that mean it's any less real?" And this is going to be a theme of this episode and the next episode, this idea that in fact, right, the things that our mind contributes to reality are essential. They're actually not just these kind of airy extras that happen to bubble up from our accidental brain chemistry. They're an essential part of reality, and the only reality that we know is the reality mediated through our human consciousness, through our human experience. We have this idea that if we kind of, if there were no people around, then atoms would be bouncing off of each other in this kind of mechanical way. But even an atom, right, is a function of whatever's out there, because there is something objective and true out there, right? But it's a function of that interacting with our consciousness, and we identify certain particles and behaviors, right? But the ordering function of our consciousness is part of reality. So all of this is simply to say, like, yes, the Kallipolis can't truly ever come into being, but as a pattern, as a model for ordering our actions in the real world and our sort of spiritual life, it has a real effect on our behaviors, whether we're living under the most tyrannical possible regime and just trying to, find the best way to resist, or whether we're living in, a pretty good republic where everything is going pretty well. Irrespective of that, right? The Kallipolis is a real thing. It's just a real thing that exists in the mind, right? It is a kind of, it's a form, essentially. It's an ideal toward which we orient ourselves, but why does that make it any less real? Is kind of what Plato is getting at here.